Charlie, I'd like to talk with you a little bit about Catholic social teaching, especially what it has to say about the important topic of human work. It's a topic that needs addressing. The year 1991 is a 100th anniversary of the issuance of Rerum Novarum, the first great Catholic social encyclical by Leo XIII, so it's a fitting time to speak about that. Let's just talk about Catholic social teaching in general for a few minutes before we zero in on the notion of work. As I said, it takes us back 100 years. I think it's good to keep that somewhat in context because when we look at the earlier part of the 19th century, before 1891, the Church had sort of absented itself from the social concerns. The Syllabus of Errors in the 1860s by Pope Pius IX sort of said no to everything that was modern, including freedom of the press and general human rights and so on. And so I think the world as a whole had written off the Catholic Church as having much to say about social questions. And then suddenly we got 1891, Pope Leo XIII reintroduces the Catholic Church into the dialogue about how we're going to improve the modern world with this famous encyclical Rerum Novarum. You just want to comment a little bit about that to that point?
Sure, Jim. I think it's probably a combination of things. Certainly there's a void, to a great extent, prior to that, which may in part be the fact that you had Leo XIII, just the same way that you had a Vatican Council because John the 23rd entered on his term as Pope at that point. But you also have the whole history of the 19th century in Europe in terms of both political and economic developments, the rise of the industrial age, and you have a church in the late 19th century beginning to address issues of workers, of the use of material goods, of economic rights issues in a way that wasn't heard before because the issues themselves were emerging in a 50 to 90 year period before that in a way that hadn't been there before. And so while certainly it would have been nice to see ourselves celebrating a 200 or 300 year tradition at this point, the 100 years, though, I think, as you look at some of the themes of the dignity of person especially, certainly have longer roots in a theological and philosophical tradition in the Church, but the way they come down in terms of specific economic issues and political issues, yes, the last century has certainly seen a tremendous outburst, if you will, of Church documentation dealing with those issues.
You put the emphasis on the person of Leo XIII, and I think that is important. I just sort of remind ourselves he was born in 1810, educated by the Jesuits. He was a canon lawyer, as a lot of people who rise in church circles are.
Certainly.
And he was a pope for 25 years, one of the longer reigns. We also remember him for his great interest in Thomistic philosophy, of reintroducing the study of Thomas Aquinas almost as a new official orthodoxy in the church. So he made a lot of contributions, and he really did want Catholics to live as participants in the modern liberal world rather than just forming a ghetto and going off in their own enclave. And so it was out of that larger context, I think, that he wrote this great encyclical Rerum Novarum that we keep celebrating periodically, and especially on the 100th anniversary. Remind ourselves a little bit about that Rerum Novarum. I mean, it did take up the whole question of work, didn't it? I mean, what was crucial for him were the workers who were suffering due to the capitalistic system, a really laissez-faire kind of capitalism in which we had these great entrepreneurs and the rise of industrialization and the factory system. We had children working in the factories, women being exploited, workers not making a decent salary, and so on. It was in that context that Pope Leo XIII thought that the Church should enter this modern debate.
And I think that's a consistent point, Jim, again, around the person issue. I think his point of entree was not so much an economic analysis, but the question of what's happening to people as a result of large factories, as a result of a move in certain parts of Europe at least, from a predominantly very old agricultural land-based kind of economy to an industrial age kind of thing. And what was happening to people, whether it was to children in factories, whether it was workers who were working 60, 70-hour weeks in unsafe conditions. And so that concern about the dignity of people, and I think that continues to be a thread in the whole body of Catholic social teaching, that says the church's concern is precisely because, if you will, the church is in the people business, and what happens to people is a concern to the church. And at that point, things were beginning to happen to people, not just individually, but collectively, because of those economic and industrial developments, that the church said we need to address this simply to be consistent with our attentiveness to what happens to people.
I think that's well put. The whole medieval world broke down, and you had urbanization and industrialization and so on. So you had a new world, and people, as you well point out, were suffering. And church had to say, what are we going to do about it? And one of the things they said was, well, workers have a right to organize into unions. That became one of the key points of Rerum Novarum. And also, incidentally, I say Rerum Novarum, two Latin words, social encyclicals often named in that way according to the first two Latin words of the text, of new things it meant, and it really was on the condition of workers, I guess is the other English title we sometimes use for it. So Rerum Novarum did say that, well, workers have a right to organize, and if they organize themselves, they'll be able to secure rights that they cannot do as individual workers.
And it's interesting and perhaps a bit ironic, too, that because that was certainly one of the major focuses of the document and the way the document was perceived, perhaps even more importantly, that for that document to come out at a point that the European community especially was beginning to have to struggle with the reality of some of the earlier forms of socialism, even though we're still some 30 years before the communist revolution in Russia, it, in an intriguing kind of way, seemed to raise an issue that's still being addressed, and I'm sure we'll talk about further, the whole sense that a church that seemed to be speaking in these ways seemed to be almost aligning with a socialist philosophy, a socialist way of analyzing economic issues. And yet, from the church's point of view, the sense that people, because again the church, precisely as it deals with, if you will, theological and religious issues of building community and celebrating sacraments as community, has always been comfortable with an idea of gathering people into community. The church has never had the strong individualistic strain to it that some other social structures have had. And so for the church to say people should function together is very natural and in continuity. And in the context of its day, it was sounding like just a small variation on some of the major socialist themes of the day.
Yes, and it's always been a part of Catholic social teaching ever since to try to distance itself, in a sense, both from a capitalistic system and a socialist system, or to put it another way, to be critical of both systems. And sometimes it seems as though the church was trying to work out a third way in between that, and in other times it said, well, we can't work out a third way. We can only be a critic of the ways that exist. So that's a tension within Catholic social thought. But it's true. You see criticisms on both sides of all that. Of course, what you get in the great and social encyclicals is always a criticism of both sides and certain elements of both sides that it plays up. For example, there's a great defense of private property in Rerum Novarum and in Catholic social teaching generally. And that has often been seen, private property, therefore people can own the means of production. This is to speak against a totally socialistic system. On the other hand, you've got all your corporate ideas, communal ideas, cooperative ideas that sound as though they are opposed to the individualism often spawned by capitalism. So you can see a critique on both sides, and usually in social encyclicals, both economic systems and both political parties can usually find something in there that both they agree with and disagree with.
I think it's an item, too, and it's echoed much more recently in the document of the American Catholic Bishops on Economic Justice, that talk about, again, both the direction of what a given economic system or a way of addressing the workplace, what effect the system and the structure has on the individuals, but also the corollary of what does the individual in his or her personal gifts, talents, the investment of their time and energy, what do they have to contribute not only to supporting themselves and their family in a rather private kind of circle, but what does that input of the worker contribute to the well-being of society as a whole? So again, the Church has tried to, I think, emphasize the fact that road runs in both directions, and to see either the worker as simply, well, the only thing that you put into it or get out of it is measured by your salary, would be to take a very different tack than most of the Catholic social documents.
Yes, indeed. There's a certain paternalism in Rerum Novarum. There's the idea that when it talks about the workers, it says, well, you're supposed to work hard and keep your contracts. It's and you're allowed to work and form unions to get your rights. But then when it addresses the owners and the employers and so on, it talks about, well, they should help their people, the workers, make sure they don't neglect their home or family. They should help them to make sure they don't squander their earnings, and that they must make sure that they pay them a fair wage, which has become a keynote in Catholic social thought, a just wage, as we call it. So there is this almost a paternalistic sense that probably wouldn't play real well today, calling upon the employers, the owners, to be sort of looking out for their workers in a way. Maybe we do get some of that in today's world, where they will provide recreational opportunities for workers and so on. But not too many employers are reminding their people to go to church, I don't think, although I do know companies that do that. But anyway, I'm just saying that there is a little bit of paternalism in Rerum Novarum, Leo XIII.
And that may still reflect what I think was for centuries a pattern of life that said there are certain people, whether that be the established traditional ruling family lines, the traditional upper class in a very nobility and common people kind of society, that said there are certain people who have the competence and therefore the responsibility to run things, and part of their responsibility is to care for their, by implication, less capable brothers and sisters. And I think one of the moves that we've certainly seen in our day and age is to say the less capable brothers and sisters are rather capable, as a matter of fact, and it's not so much the job of management or government or structures to take care of them as to recognize and honor their right to care for themselves.
Exactly, and that's become a major theme in more recent Catholic social teaching of empowerment, of helping people take hold of their own lives, spawned in large measure by Pope Paul VI and his work. Well, Charlie, let's just jump ahead from Rerum Novarum. What has happened is that the Church throughout the years has, and particular popes, have seen fit to honor Rerum Novarum by writing their own social encyclical. And so the next great one occurred in 1931, Quadragesimo Anno, and that's by Pope Pius XI, again named, that's 40 years after Rerum Novarum, and he's dealing with a new kind of world. There's all the economic order. If we think back, 1931, depressions around the world, economic order is not in good shape. The Pope wanted to make sure that the people understood the Church was not just on the side of the rich. He defended private property again, but reminded people labor is not just a commodity, that you can't just be buying these workers and so on. So he was very worried about things like nationalism and so on, and saw that we weren't doing well economically around the world, so he issued another encyclical to try to deal with this whole question.
The dates are interesting because once you have 1891 down, if you can do 10-year increments from there, you can dock most of the major Catholic social teachings, because they're in 10-year anniversaries from there, from Quadragesimo Anno, even as we get further on to Moderate Magistra in 1961. But again, between 1891 and 1931, you'd had World War I, which had been much more devastating in Europe than I think we in the United States ever realized. You had the Soviet Revolution, and so you had Pius XI in Quadragesimo Anno speaking very specifically to abuses of both the capitalist system and the socialist system. Again, as you said before, trying to say, folks, there's a spectrum here, both ends of which, when pushed to extremes, are terribly destructive. And by implication, saying that somewhere in the middle, in a way that honors some of both of them, is probably a more humane and a more just way of going at the issue of modern business and modern industry. But seeing human labor as something more than a commodity, where you have land costs, and you have your tax costs, and you have raw material costs, and you have labor costs, and it's just simply one more commodity that the corporation is buying, then immediately begins to fly right in the face of the human concern and the human dimension that the Church, it seems to me, has always brought to the social documents.
Right, the dignity of the worker.
The dignity of person.
Charlie, you were talking about the fact that in 10-year intervals they were writing social encyclicals. As you suggest, the next great one was 1961, the Mater Magistra, Mother and Teacher of Pope John the 23rd, of beloved memory. And then the one that I want to concentrate on because of our theme of work here is then in 1981, Laborem Exercens on human work by Pope John Paul II, our current Holy Father. And in there he specifically takes up work and makes work the real centerpiece of his whole understanding of the social question. In fact, he says that work is the key to the whole social question. Now, this might not be surprising coming from a pope who grew up in Poland and was knew Marxist thought, of course, from Marx, that how he saw us human beings as economic creatures, as largely shaped by the economic systems in which we lived. And so the Pope, I'm not saying that the Pope espoused a Marxist line, but I think there are ways in which he was influenced by the fact that he grew up in a Marxist country. And anyway, the point is that he looks at all of this now and sees work as really crucial to improving the social lot and so on. So let's concentrate a little bit on this particular encyclical. I just remind you that he did draw a lot on the Second Vatican Council, especially the Pastoral Constitution, drew a lot of his ideas on there. He talks in there also about a spirituality of work, which is very helpful, and I think we need to look at more carefully.
Seems to me that one of his points there, and again it picks up on your point earlier about the question of labor as more than simply another commodity. He reiterates a point that had been made earlier, a statement it's frequently worded in terms of the priority of labor over capital.
Yes. It
says, as a matter of fact, the human contribution to the workplace is a more significant and a more valuable and a more essential ingredient in the mix than capital. And I'm struck as I say that, even because for a while this morning, because of some stock holdings that my mother has, I spent part of this morning sitting there watching the New York Stock Exchange ticker on the local cable channel and realizing that our economic structure is so organized around the flow of capital that what the Holy Father says in that statement is something that more than, well, of course, and we go on from there, but to say, wait a minute, that is not culturally and even economically how much of our system operates, and that one might be worth some definite exploring.
Yeah, so he talks, the principle, as he says, is that labor has a priority over capital. I think the statement functions negatively in some sense, and that is that it's not supposed to just play up the system. I mean, you're not supposed to just say, well, capital is primary and people who got money are more important than other people, and people who own things should throw their weight around, and that we should just put all of the emphasis on that. I think that it is a way of enunciating once again in a new context the consistent Catholic social teaching of the primary dignity of human beings. So, I mean, and very practically he says things like this: it's human effort, it is human effort which created capital. I mean, it's because people worked hard that they had money so that they could invest. It's because people labored in factories that the factories made products and earned money so that you could build a new factory or expand this one. So I think it's as simple as that in one sense. It's a negative critique on one hand, but it's also a positive statement about how it is human effort and human work that really counts in all of this.
But also on the benefit end, and it strikes me that this is not an inherent critique of the substance of even the American economic system, because while on the one hand we say, well, the bottom line is the profit motive, and that's what the stockholders look at, and management's job is to enhance profits, etc., but to simply raise the further question about, well, what are profits for? If the profits are gained in the process of creating and making available goods and services that are for human benefit, fine. If the profit means that somebody's retirement plan is going to be solid, if the profits mean that this is part of a package where people are able to earn a decent wage and support their families, this is not to say that the profit motive and the capital issues are irrelevant, but it's to ultimately say, is money and is financial gain an end in itself, or do you have to raise the question, what does that make possible for human beings?
Right, and I think that has been a constant theme in Catholic social teaching, is that all of that is for the common good, that all of that effort and the whole economic system is for building up the kingdom in the world, as we put it in theological terms, and more secular terms, to improve the common good, to make life better for more people, to create a situation where more people can live with dignity and have their rights and so on. so that the whole economic system gets challenged again. I think what it would say, and many conservative commentators feel the Pope was too harsh on capitalism, I know, but what he wants to make sure is that the capitalistic system has a human face, that it doesn't end up exploiting people. And many conservative commentators feel that when we move into a new phase of global capitalism, that has to be factored in as well. And I'm not sure I want to get into all that, but let me take us in a direction here, Charlie, to make sure that we get some sense of what's in the encyclical Laborem Exercens. And one major idea is that he sees the great dignity of human work. And when he's talking about work, he's talking about not just paying jobs, but all human effort. And I think that's very important to see. It includes what women do in the house, what parents do in raising children, what volunteers do in making organizations run, as well as workers in the factory and people in offices and entrepreneurs. So everybody's expending purposeful effort is involved in what the Pope calls work. And he says, when you and I do that, when we all do it together, we are helping to spread the kingdom. He says we are co-creating the world with God. We're joining our effort with Jesus Christ. We are helping to spread the community of love and peace and justice in the world. So that's one aspect of what work is all about for him. It gives it tremendous dignity, of course, to say what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis is actually joining myself with God in the whole effort to create a better world.
As I try to present that to people sometimes, Jim, I think it's the sense that what people do is valuable precisely because of what, in the theological framework of Christian faith, people are. You know, and as we carry on this conversation in the whole Easter season, the sense of what has happened to human nature because of the presence, the presence among us of God himself, that we are different, and because of that, what we do, the way we express our being, our gifts, our talents, our insights, our creativity, all of which are inherent values in, I think, the American system, that is where the value comes from. And to reduce the value of it to simply whether this produces a product that has a certain financial level to it is one, but not the sole and not at all the primary concern in how you measure value.
Right, and when you start talking about your work is spreading the kingdom, what it does is invite you to look at deeper levels of it all. Mm-hmm. You could look at parents and say, well, you know, you're helping to spread the kingdom in all of your efforts to be good parents. And and a lot of that is hidden. In other words, it's seed sown in the heart of the offspring. It might bear fruit only years later when they appreciate the hard work or the sacrifices made so that they could get an education, for example. Or any field you would be in. You could say there are often hidden benefits going on. So it's really the eyes of faith that would discern the truth of this idea that it is through our work that we co-create the world and spread the kingdom.
And I think part of that is because we've gotten so used to separating the sacred and the secular that seems so ordinary. Well, it's what I do, it's my job, and the sense that somehow religious value or personal value has to be something above that or outside of that, but a whole incarnational sense that's where it happens. That when I choose to spend, the afternoon repainting the basement with my son, there's a religious value there.
Right.
And perhaps our whole cultural tendency to separate religion and the rest of life comes back to haunt us at this point.
Indeed. I think you're absolutely right, and that's what we're trying to overcome in this Catholic social teaching. There's a second aspect of work that's important to the Pope. Not only are we creating the world, but we are fulfilling ourselves. And so he has many paragraphs about the fact that work is good for us. It's the way we actualize ourselves. It helps us overcome our indolence, our laziness. It helps us develop our talents. It helps us to feel as though we're making a contribution. Mm-hmm. It enables us to put bread on the table for the whole family and so on. So there is a self-fulfillment, the Pope claims, in work. That's why he's very opposed to work that is dehumanizing or that is merely toilsome and it simply saps our energy. So he wants work to be more fulfilling and the way we make ourselves to be better people, construct ourselves, so to speak.
And if you invert that image in that situation, you talk to anyone who's been for an extended period of time unemployed. And the sense of worthlessness, and I'm not valuable, and I have nothing to contribute, and they will use exactly that terminology as they're experiencing it very negatively because it's not there.
Exactly. Yeah, the unemployment problem must come up when you're talking about work, and I'm glad you raised that, because many people's problem isn't that they're working too hard or their work is unfulfilling, it's they don't have work.
And would love to.
That's right. And that's why the Catholic bishops, I think, were so much on target when they dealt with this topic of work by saying the key to the social question is employment. We got to have jobs for people, and that's society's task to create these jobs. And when they say society, they don't mean the government. They mean the state, the government, they mean private enterprise, they mean labor unions, they mean churches. Everybody's supposed to help cooperate to produce greater opportunities for work. So employment's key to all of this.
I think the fact, too, that as we look at the way we've tried as a society to cover the unemployed, namely the whole welfare system, the same thing happens, that the people that are caught up in that, even though it may be a survival issue, the self-image issues, the fact that study after study has said that people who are on welfare do not want to be there. They would rather be employed at gainful employment and carry their own weight. Stereotypes to the contrary notwithstanding. The evidence is that most of those folks would rather be out doing something that makes them feel good about themselves, lets them carry their weight, lets them contribute.
Charlie, let me just try to quickly add a couple things the Pope says. I think part of his solution to the problem of work is to say, let's get more involvement of workers in capital, in the productive process. So he would be very much in favor of worker ownership plans, democracy on the shop floor, involvement of workers. That's another important piece of what he's talking about. And finally, I think I'm going to have to wind up here, and that is that Christ plays a crucial role in this. In our work, we're following Christ. In the toilsome, heavy part of it, we're carrying our cross with Christ. We're united with Christ, who himself was a laborer, worked with his hands. So we have a whole spirituality of work that develops out of this. Well, Charlie, we've been looking at the Catholic social teaching, and we've tried to see it in a historical context, remembering Rerum Novarum in 1891, and the continuing effort of all of us to find greater meaning in our work, to humanize it, and in that way to help spread the kingdom in the world.